Hi everyone, welcome to the second webinar in Manupatra Academy's summer webinar series. My name is Urvashi Agrawal and I'm a legal editor and outreach coordinator at Manupatra. The topic of today's session is how legal design can make the law more user-friendly. For this session, we have two amazing panelists with us. Please welcome Ms. Mahak and Mr. Siddharth. Mahak is the co-founder and partner of the D-Van. It's a design thinking and innovation lab in India. Mahak has an advanced training in design thinking from the D School HPI and an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business with a specialization in technology and operations management and business analytics. Her work majorly focuses on building a future-ready, agile mindset in students, institutions, and organizations through quick interventions and new models of education. She believes that the future of education is to support lifelong learning that can adapt itself to the changing realities, thereby leading to holistic and positive growth for people and organizations. A theatre enthusiast, you can find her trying her acting skills every once in a while with theatre performances. Mr. Siddharth, he is a postdoctoral researcher at Tilburg University and works on matters at the intersection of law, data, and society. He is the founder of Justice Adda, a law and design social venture which develops innovative legal content to make the law accessible, useful, and usable in India. He is also the co-founder of the D-Van. Welcome, Mahak and Siddharth. Over to you now.
Thanks very much, Urvashi, and thank you to all of you for joining this afternoon. I'm just going to share my slides and then we can begin. So, can you see them?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. We have a hand raised from someone. Was that by mistake? Okay. All right. So thanks a lot, Urvashi, and thank you to the Manupatra team for inviting us to do this webinar. What we're going to do today is tell you a little bit about legal design and also through the work that we've been doing at Justice Adda and the D-Van. So thanks, Urvashi, already for the introduction. So I won't spend any more time doing this, but we do a lot of design thinking training, both specific to the legal sector and also otherwise. And we're interested in approaching the question of design thinking also because of the ways in which we're interested in bringing more sort of critical thinking to education and educational approaches. And with this in mind, we're really interested in trying to investigate what are the ways in which we can build more collaborative, more co-designed approaches to thinking about law and thinking about education more generally. The structure of our presentation today is going to be where we introduce you to legal design more generally. We then look at how we can think about design not as something that's abstract, but that's something that sort of structures our everyday life. Mahak will tell you a little bit more through some case studies about what we see as key to good design, and then we will end with some examples and activities. Typically, when we do sessions on legal design, this is over the course of a few days. So we're going to give you a brief introduction to what it could look like. But of course, if you remain interested, feel free to get in touch with us for a more deep dive into the topic. One of the things that we want to introduce to you today is really to think about when you approach legal problems, what is the emphasis that you place? Do you place an emphasis on trying to find a solution immediately, or do you place emphasis on trying to understand what is it that you are solving for? For us, we find this quotation instructive because what it suggests is that we need to actually spend a little bit of time in defining the problem that we really want to solve. So whether this problem is a question of access to justice, whether it is to do with legal information, whether it's to do with financial literacy, whether it's to do with questions of education, what are the key aspects that undergird this particular problem? We see design really as being able to open up the problem space before we can actually identify what a solution could look like. Which is why we also want to emphasize that in thinking about legal design, one of the emphasis that we place is to try and understand what is the key aspect that causes a particular problem to exist. We situate this work on legal design also in terms of the changing legal profession. And I think one of the things that all of you and from Urvashi have understood that many of you are students, some of you are also practicing lawyers. And we wanted to also unpack where is it that we're seeing legal design. And this is from work by the Stanford Legal Design Lab and Margaret Hagan, who has worked in legal design, where they offer a sense of what a next generation law grad would look like. So typically, this idea is when we are actually looking at the influence of technology or we're looking at the influence of design, it is creating new kinds of structures. We will see, as in the work of Justice Adda, for instance, the work that we are doing to look at the intersection between visualization, technology, and the law. There are others who see law in terms of product development. There are some who see law in terms of looking for kind of new business models. We look at law also in terms of user-centered strategy. So can we actually understand from a client's point of view what is important to them and how to remake strategies based on their interests? We're also interested in exploring ways in which lawyers do not work in sort of individualized silos, but also work across the sector. So to give you a sense of these different roles is also why we are interested in introducing this element of design, because design focuses to us also a change in particular mindsets. Many of you may have seen that when your first experience with court or first experience of the law, there may be challenges that you find that are often quite harsh. They may be transactional. They may be bereft of empathy. So this can mean, for instance, for the first times when you have to interact with a particular judicial officer or particular legal instruments, what do you actually see as underpinning those relationships? In this article by a researcher at IDEO, she speaks about how oftentimes legal processes and legal experiences are designed in a way where the touch points are filled with frustration, confusion, and disempowerment. What we are interested in thinking about is what are the ways in which we can reshape this interaction. For instance, in a recent project that we've been undertaking, we are looking at what are the ways in which we can make the courtroom experience something that speaks to how people receive it, whether this is in terms of the ways in which signages are designed, whether this is in terms of the ways in which information is provided about particular courts, whether this is in terms of the ways in which lawyers, clients, the judges sit within a courtroom. What are the challenges that actually need to be overcome in order to have better access to justice? On the right side of my screen, you will see different ways in which we've tried to extricate what a lawyer's mindset is and what a designer's mindset is. This reduces the complexity of what lawyers do and designers do, but in a sense, it is to suggest to you that there are certain ways in which we are trained. As lawyers, we are trained to be experts in particular fields. We are trained to be able to provide a particular kinds of niche knowledge that is otherwise not available. And that niche knowledge often means that you do not necessarily build this knowledge in a collaborative sense, which is where a designer mindset kind of emerges, where you see your interaction with your client, your interaction with your customer is necessarily something that is collaborative, not as something that is between an expert and a user. So we're interested in also speaking about this shift, about what it means to be able to draw both from your experiences in terms of the expertise that you have, but also to draw on what your user and what your client really brings to the table, and how can you use that experience and that knowledge to be able to come up with strategies that will make it even more productive and in their interest. Because after a point, what is interesting to do is, and this is really where we are interested in thinking about design, is what are the ways in which we can think about the real human need and sometimes behind a particular problem. For us, design has three aspects: the question of desirability, feasibility, and viability. This entails that we need to think about the following questions. When we are interested in the question of desirability, we're interested in asking the question of what is it that users are looking for? What is the kind of product that is unique to them, and why should it work for them? In a legal setting, we need to ask the question of when we are offering advice, when we are providing a particular service, are we doing this from the standpoint of what is it in the interest of the customer themselves. Secondly, we need to also see whether it is feasible to actually accomplish this. What are the kinds of workable solutions that we could actually ensure to take into account the fact that when we actually provide such a service, it may have to be in a particular context. And then thirdly, viability. What are the kinds of business and financial aspects that will actually go into ensuring that such a product and service can actually be delivered? When we think about law and design specifically, and from the work of Justice Adda, we ask the following question: how can we make law and legal services useful and usable to our end user? For this, we have the following approaches. One, we focus on people. So we're interested in who our target audience is, what are their preferences, and what they are looking for. It is important, and as we will tell you, is one of the major aspects of our approach is how do we actually focus on people's needs and experiences. And by focusing on people's needs and experiences, to draw from the work of Margaret Hagan, how can you focus on the front end as well as the back end of legal services, which means that we have to focus on how people interact with particular services. This may mean interact with a particular website in order to buy a particular product, but also, so in this, for instance, if you wanted to go to a court to understand how a courtroom works, where do you actually have to submit documents, where do you have to make certain payments, but also to think about the back end, which are what are the kinds of structures and legal procedures that determine why a system is working the way it is. So we're interested to think about this from two perspectives. It is not sufficient to just build good interfaces and good technologies. You also need to think about what are the structures that result in the need for these technologies in the first place. So we see the potential for design also to influence information, to influence products, and to influence services across the board. In our research, one of the things that we do, and for those of you who are studying, is what is the ways in which we can think about legal design also from a research perspective, is we look at it at three perspectives. Firstly, it is important to be able to gather as much information as possible about the context and the problem that you are solving. This means that you need to examine both the lived realities, but also what is it that experts and what is it that contemporaries within that field are really saying about a particular problem. Secondly, it becomes important to frame a particular question. What are the contexts within which you are doing this work? What is your role as a researcher? What is your role as a designer? What is your role as a lawyer? What are the kinds of privileges and powers that you bring to a particular role? And how does that influence where you go further? And the third step is in terms of testing, where we are interested in thinking about what is the feasibility, durability, and sustainability of doing a particular project, and can you actually think about this in very clear operational terms. Legal design can take very different roles. It can be aspects related to visual legal design, and we'll give you some examples of this. It can also be thinking about services. It can be in terms of looking at the business practices of a law firm and law firm profitability. It can also be in terms of thinking about organizations and how can we build more efficient and agile organizational processes. But it can also be something that's deeper. It can be in terms of thinking about a more complex layer, which is to think about what are the institutions that result in particular barriers or challenges to ensure that people have access to fair, equitable justice in our context. Drawing from the work at Justice Adda, I want to give you some examples of what we have done. So for instance, some of you may have seen the project that we did with Manupatra several years ago, which is the case drawing project, where we were interested in looking at how is it that the Supreme Court of India writes its cases, and can we actually produce these cases in a language that people can access easily. So for this, the illustrated cases of the Supreme Court look at what are some of the facts of the case, what are the key questions of law, and then what is it that the court has decided by using both plain language as well as illustrations to make this a demystified way of thinking about the law. If you see to the right corner of my screen, it's an example of an affidavit, which is part of a project called the Graphic Law Library, which you can examine at Justice Adda. And this explains basic legal documents, how to write a will, how to write a lease agreement, what are the key components of such documents. On the left side of the screen, you will also see something called tracking my data footprint, which is to explain the notion of data and privacy to people in a language that they understand. So, for instance, if you spend time on Instagram, if you spend time on Twitter, we also want to give you a sense of how your activities also determine how you are then offered suggestions in terms of the algorithms that you are engaging with. So, we want to find relatable ways to think about the law and think about the ways in which the law systematizes and structures relations in our lives. A very good example of the ways in which legal design has been used is through a contract automation company, Juro, which has come up with a new contract to explain what is it that, how to sort of look at rights and entitlements for that privacy contract. So they here explain, and if you've seen any, and if many of you have probably signed contracts, you will see that the language that is used is very complex. They explain what is the data that they collect, how they use their data, how third parties process data, but they also tell you what your own rights and entitlements are. They see contracts as necessarily a conversation between you and the entity, and in that sense, they want it to be an open and fair process through which you can actually garner your rights and also do this in a way that is in your interest. So these are different ways in which legal design has been used to sort of reshape conversations about the law. But what I would like to also say is that it's not just about thinking about this aesthetically. It is more important to think about what is it that is important from an intuitive level for people to ensure that when they actually think about engaging with legal processes, it is in a way that is valuable to them. So having said this, what I'd like to now bring you in on is talk a little bit about trying design and looking at what you actually see as design in everyday life. So I'd like, I expect that you can probably type into the chat. So I'd like you to, or type into the Q&A, I'd like you to look at this picture and tell me what you see as some of the key aspects that go into the design of this coffee pot. And Urvashi, if you can maybe make people or unmute the group, that would be helpful. Okay. Sandesh has raised his hand. Okay. Can you explain both Sandesh and SS a little bit about what you mean? Okay, Sandesh, you can go first. Okay. Okay, great. So one example is that you can't pour through it the spout and the handle are on the same side, and the design is not feasible, which is a key element. Okay, absolutely. So one of the things that this example is very helpful to tell us is also how each of you have thought immediately about the notion of usability. You have tried to explore what is the purpose of having such a coffee pot, and then you have tried to think about what are the ways in which you can then use it. This speaks to sort of two important principles of design. One is the aspect of the discoverability, that one should know how to use a particular product, but also the understanding. That is, what are the ways in which one can be able to exercise such a function. Now, this is from an exhibition called Impossible Objects, and I'd invite you to go and check it out. And this particular exhibit is called Coffee Pot for Masochists, because it speaks exactly as to some of you have said, the ways in which actually if we tweak certain kinds of design, it can actually make it impossible to use. Would any of you have ideas on, okay, I see Sandesh has already said the handle should be on the other side. If you didn't change this design, what would you do in order to ensure that you can still have coffee and not burn yourself? Do you have any ideas on what you could do? Okay. That sounds practical. So you'd hold it from the other side, perhaps use, okay. I'm not sure if the volume's working, so I just invite you to type it straight into the Q&A.
Cap side and then pour the coffee, whatever it is, from the other side.
Okay. Close one of the openings and use the other one. All right. Okay. Thanks for your input so far. I'm going to ask you a slightly more different question. How many of you, when you shop online, read the terms and conditions, and as lawyers or to be lawyers, what are your how do you sort of approach the question of terms of service on websites? Okay, so it depends on the type of website that you are using. So why do you make a distinction between types of websites? Sarita, would you like to go? Okay, can someone type into the chat about what you actually see as some of the problems with some of these contracts? Okay, so we have some interesting examples. The authenticity of the website plays a big role. If the site is trusted, then perhaps it's possible. Some have raised the question of privacy. Some have said that there may not even be a choice. You just have to accept the terms if you want to use a website. But otherwise, legal jargon is a challenge. Excessive lengths make it inaccessible. So one of the things that this particular example, and it's from a website called Terms of Service, didn't read, it examines what are the kinds of things that we sign up to when we use Google or YouTube or Facebook or Wikipedia, and the ways in which they collect data. And why this is important is when one actually thinks about the nature and the design of a contract. What is it that who is it that the contract is really protecting? From your answers, it is clear that as users, you don't necessarily see the contracts as protecting your interests, but rather protecting the interest of the corporation. So if we are really interested in the question of design and user centricity, what are the ways in which we could build a contract that takes into account the interests of both parties? And is there a way in which this can be redesigned that accounts for the ways in which people engage with it? Yeah, great. So basic problem is language and how comprehensive they are. And one needs to also think about when, as lawyers or budding lawyers, what role do we play in terms of facilitating and continuing to ensure that legal jargon is used as a strategy to ensure that it obfuscates people's basic understandings of what the law is and how the law can actually be practiced. A final example before I hand over to Mahak is if one looks at WhatsApp, you've seen that a few years ago this was a new feature. And I'd like you to think about what do you actually think is the purpose of such a design? And does it work for you? Okay, so messages that you type and would regret if the other person saw, typos. So I'm assuming you think it works. Mohammad Raza says it creates more transparency and the receiver knows that a message has been deleted. Okay. Do any of you think it does not work? Because from the two responses, I see that two people agree with this particular design. Okay, I don't like the design. If I am deleting it, I don't want the other person to know. Okay, the sole purpose of hiding the design becomes infructuous. Okay, great. So we have quite a variety of answers, and thanks for participating here. So I think you all raise interesting points. Some speak to the fact that it has a practical functionality, that it allows transparency, it allows us to like retract certain aspects of a conversation that we would not like. But others speak to the fact that the purpose of actually deleting it in itself is infructuous as a consequence of having this deleted message. So again, when one actually thinks through certain features, when one thinks through what we are providing in terms of legal services or design in everyday aspects, what are the ways in which we are doing so that also accounts for the fact that the user will receive it and experience it in different ways. So again, coming to what we have spoken about earlier, it's important to move beyond how you see your understanding of a particular problem to also take the experiences that exist in the people that you're working and collaborating with. Another aspect that we've been following in our work, which also corresponds to the work of legal design, is this notion of design justice. And why design justice is interesting is because it makes a distinction. It says when you are actually thinking about particular products and services, you must move beyond designing for a particular individual or group to actually designing with. And that's something that we also want you to think about. What is the difference between designing for and designing with? Because in some ways, what this emphasizes is that the knowledge that you may have is very valuable, but you have to take that knowledge also to account that it may have its own limitations. And how can you bring in the experience and expertise from people that you are collaborating with? And that is one of the big takeaways that we would like you to also mull over when you're looking at this intersection between law and design. To take you a little bit further into design principles, I'll now hand it over to Mahak, who will go forward with our presentation.
Thanks, Siddharth. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, great. Hope you can all see it.
Yes, Mahak.
Perfect. Okay. So, well, first of all, so glad that, so many people could join us today. So the second half of this presentation is a little bit more focused on the idea of design, because ultimately, whether it is law or any other domain of design in general, there are certain principles that we have to keep in mind, and the process doesn't change, because the process through which we're trying to understand people and create design or create something that can keep user experience in mind doesn't quite change. So even when we think about how can law be more friendly, or how can it be made more, how can the user experience be better, ultimately it's about focusing on people. And therefore, in that sense, the process of design doesn't quite change when it is in the legal domain or whether it's outside the legal domain. When we think about the idea of good design, I think nothing explains it better than this picture, where the idea is that, you may design a process, a policy, a framework a certain way, but ultimately users decide how they're going to use it and whether or not they're going to use it a certain way, right? As the picture explains, ultimately the user experience can be very different from how a product or a path or a certain thing may be designed. So therefore, at the heart of anything design or anything that you're trying to create with this idea of, how do we make it more friendly for our users, we have to think about the people first, the people who are going to be experiencing this. This is a very famous picture, and perhaps some of you have, seen this, but it'll be interesting to know what you think of it. So this was a truck that got stuck under, this is a real sort of situation that happened where a truck got stuck under a bridge. And, for hours, the truck was stuck, it's on a highway, people can't really get through, all of those issues. And so they were trying to understand how to really get the truck, which is stuck under the bridge, to come out. Any ideas on simple ways through which this truck could actually be taken out of that bridge or taken out from under that bridge? And you can use the chat to just maybe put down your ideas. Like
take out the air in the wheel, then it reduces the height and then automatically can be taken off slowly.
Absolutely, right. And so it's interesting because, now I know this has become a very famous image and a very famous depiction of the problem. But I think when this actually happened, people spend a lot of time calling engineers and calling mechanics and all of that to unscrew the truck and see what can be done. And they actually started doing it before actually a child that was passing the location noticed the tires and commented that, why don't you just take the air out, and that would help the truck come out. And so the idea of sort of presenting this example really is that very often it's essentially what we can see or cannot see that decides how we design a certain product or how we try and solve a problem. So for a lot of adults, because they couldn't even focus on the air, and because we tend to complicate matters and complex I think solutions come to us much easier. The idea was to cut the truck, call mechanics, try and unscrew parts of the truck. But no one thought about something as simple as just getting the air out of the tire. And so sometimes solutions can be very simple, and the idea is to really kind of focus on that part of the problem and try and build out very simple solutions, keeping ultimately the end result that we want to see at the end of the process, right? So just to kind of take you through the process, because like I said, ultimately, whether it is within the domain of law or outside the domain of law, the process is one that remains the same. And if you were to look up any articles or anything about design thinking, you'll come across something very similar online, where the process in itself has about 5 to 6 different steps. We stick to this 5-step process, where it starts with empathizing. So the idea is to first understand the human element of any problem. Ultimately, who is the human behind this problem who's getting affected, and can we really understand that person's problem? The second is then to define the problem, right? Because again, when we think of a problem, it can be a reasonably complex situation. And so how do you kind of separate the key issues from the noise and only focus on that? The third part of the process is ideate, which is, and this is where, you try and come up with as many ideas as possible. And at this stage, no idea is a bad idea, right? The fourth part of this is prototyping. Again, extremely important and something that people often miss, because we try and come up with ideas and then we get so excited about it that we just want to execute it. But the idea of the design thinking process is that prototype it and see if it actually works, if the users actually respond to it, or is it similar to the path that I showed, where we may have developed it a certain way, but the user experience is entirely different. And that's what a prototype can do for us. And the last part of this is to test the prototype so that you can get some feedback on it and fine-tune the process itself. So that's what the process really looks like. And like I said, I think anywhere you go, these are broadly the steps that you will come across. But what's interesting is not the steps in itself, because while it looks like a linear process, it really is not. When you're trying to solve a problem, or when you're trying to sort of look at a process and think about, or any problem and think about how do I develop a reasonably simple solution for this that can actually change the user experience, it's not a very linear process, right? So you ultimately end up jumping from one stage to the next and maybe coming back to it if you can't really solve the problem. But what's happening in the background looks something like this. So this is called the double diamond approach. And again, I think something which is, I think it's an important concept to keep in mind. So really what we're doing here is bringing together the idea of convergence and divergence. I think for all of us, convergence is something that comes very easily. I think all our education systems, all our life, We're used to, getting a problem and then trying to build out a solution for it. But, it doesn't happen very often that we try and diverge from a point, which is to say that force yourself to consider 100 different possibilities that could come out of a single situation. And that's not something that we are wired to do. And the idea of the design thinking process is to actually force ourselves to do a little bit of that. So as you can see, the double diamond approach is really about constantly diverging, considering all your possibilities, and then sort of converging so that you have a host of different possibilities and ideas that you've considered before really landing on a particular solution, right? And, prototyping it. So the first diamond in this process is, discover and define, where you're trying to initially diverge and understand the problem space. So you may start with one simple problem and say, hey, how do I make, just to say, let's say, how do we make the terms and conditions on a particular website easier for people to understand? And then you try and diverge as much as possible to consider the problem space and understand what are the different things that people go through? What are the different aspects of this problem? How does it affect people in different ways? Why is user behavior currently a certain way? And then based on all of that information and research, kind of come down to defining one particular part of that problem set that you would like to solve for. And then the second part, or the second diamond, is really, again, going through the divergence and convergence process, where you try and go through as many potential solutions or as many ideas as possible before you actually, decide maybe that this is the one solution that I want to develop. So before you put your sort of foot down and say, okay, this is it, this is what I believe in, and this is what I'd like to develop, the idea is to go as broad as possible. What's really happening in the background looks a little bit like this, and this is typically how any problem is solved, where when you think about a problem, there are different uncertainties, patterns, insights that get thrown on us. And so through this process of the double diamond, or the 5 different steps, or however you want to interpret this for yourself, what's really happening is that we're taking these pieces of insights, these different patterns, these different uncertainties, and trying to get to a certain level of clarity and focus through the process, right? And that's what we're really trying to design for. Another important aspect of this, and I know this is a lot of theory, but bear with me. The next part of this is going to be really trying to share some examples with you of how the process works. But the other important concept is, why is divergence really important? And I kind of tried to stress on this earlier as well, that convergence comes to us naturally, but divergence doesn't. And so this is something that's kind of been recorded over time, where, to really come up with ideas that could solve a problem creatively, it takes time. So the ebb and flow of ideas, or really how ideas develop over time, looks a little bit like what you see on the graph, where over time it expands from the boring, the more sort of predictable ideas to the brilliant ideas. And you will go through the ebb and flows of, oscillating between brilliance and absolute absurdity on the other side. And that's bound to happen. And that's kind of the space that we have to give ourselves. And through the design thinking mindset, through the tools that we use in our workshops, and of course, this is a different kind of workshop, but when we do longer workshops where we take people through the process, the idea is to give them tools to experience exactly this, that how do you see yourself breaking out of this range of boring ideas to really, brilliance and absurdity on the extremities. What I also thought would be interesting to present to all of you, before we get on to the case studies, is how Siddharth and I at the DVAN have developed design thinking. So for us, we really try to follow a very simple framework, and we think this is a framework that can be used in pretty much any part of your, work life. We call it the 4P framework, where the idea is to start off with focusing on the problem. So what is the problem? Can we interpret the problem a certain way? Can we identify the root cause of the problem? Once we've identified that, focusing on the people. So really identifying who the target audience is and what is it that this audience is really looking for. Then sort of moving on to the possibilities or the ideation phase to understand that which exact, part of the problem are we trying to solve? And within that, let's say, domain of the problem, what are the different ideas that we can actually come up with? And this is where the ebb and flow of ideas and sort of using different tools within the designer's toolkit become very important. And the last part of this is therefore then the product itself, or building the service or the product or a certain representation of the solution. So we call this the 4P framework, and we think it's a very easy way to really remember what are the different aspects of design thinking that you might need to consider. And just to sort of make this easier to understand, we thought it might be useful at this point to really take you through two different examples or case studies of how, in different contexts, design thinking has been used, or this 4P framework has been used to come up with exciting solutions. So, and again, this might be something that you all are aware of, but it'll be interesting to go through it anyway. Iodine deficiency is a serious issue in rural parts of India, and not just in India. This is a problem across the world. Iodine deficiency, of course, causes some very serious issues: breast cancer, breast diseases, complications during pregnancies. In fact, even brain damage is something that can happen because of iodine deficiency. And while iodine supplements are available, people can either not afford it, or even if they can afford it, and if, let's say, the supplements are not very expensive, they're not aware of how exactly to use it. And that awareness of, that this is important for me and I need to use it every day doesn't quite exist. So that in itself is a very big problem that needs to be solved. So Grey for Good, which is a philanthropic, organization, sort of teamed up with a design thinking team to sort of understand what can they do about this particular problem. And the first part of really, delving deep into the problem was to understand the people. Who are the people in rural India, especially women, who are going through this problem, right? Now, when we think about women in rural India, of course, you can come up with different kinds of personas, but really delving deep into the psyche of these women, one thing is that a lot of these women don't put themselves as the center of, they're not the center of their own life. It's their families who are the center of their life. So to really, try and do something for themselves isn't something that comes to them naturally. Plus, if you're thinking about user behavior, anyway, changing user behavior is not easy. Convincing them to save something, to save some amount of money for themselves, for their health, to really put it into a supplement, something that, is not going to change their life today, but really, lead to a better life over time, is not something that's easy to explain to them. And so the idea was that, even though iodine is important for them and, overall it'll lead to better health, how do you explain to them that this is important? At the same time, you also want to make sure that they don't overdose. So you have to regulate it a certain way. And there are, of course, literacy, education issues as well. So the second part of this process was to really understand the people or the target audience that is suffering from this problem. The third part of this was to then consider the possibilities. Of course, pills is a way to go. A lot of supplements are available today in the form of pills. But is it the best way to supply this to women in rural India? Because ultimately, when we think of ideas for these women, it has to be something that's easy to use. It shouldn't really change their, user behavior in a huge way. It should be inexpensive. It should be something that becomes a habit very easily, and something that, ensures that they don't overdose, right? And so keeping all of these things in mind, this is what they came up with, which is a very simple bindi infused with iodine, right? And so a lot of people in India wear bindis, a lot of women in India wear bindis, and it's something that's a part of their everyday life. And by simply making sure that the bindis have enough iodine in them, the organization was able to ensure that at a cheap cost and without really changing user behavior, because a bindi is something that these women use every day, that they're able to increase the amount of iodine that the women consume. And because iodine is something that can be soaked in through the skin, it works. And just by this simple intervention, women were able to receive 12% of their daily iodine dosage through, a simple life-saving dot. And while 12% is not everything, and there's still a lot more to be done, it's much better than where we were. And so this is one example of how, by simply sort of understanding the user behind the problem and understanding how can we influence them easily in a simple manner, a huge problem, something as big as, iodine deficiency, can be solved at least to a certain degree, right? We also thought at this point it would be interesting to give you a short example on how organizations have used legal design specifically. So within the domain of law, how can design thinking really be used to influence user behavior and to also sort of, make law more user-friendly. So, of course, using AI for justice is something that, people have spoken about for many, many years now. And the solution that I'm going to present today is something that developed even before ChatGPT. Of course, we all know about ChatGPT now, and we're talking about generative AI and all of that. But in general, AI and within the generative AI space as well, there are similar issues, right? Which is that AI can solve a lot of problems. It can increase efficiency. It can obviously bring in more clarity. When you're trying to manage a lot of different information, which is coming from like different people, you're trying to engage with past information, historical cases as well, and you're looking at complex decision making, AI is something that can simplify all of that. However, for AI to be able to do this in an unbiased manner, we're trusting AI to be able to sift through troves of data and be able to do that in an unbiased way, be able to identify patterns, be able to not be influenced by certain strategies or certain decisions only, to be able to detect any outliers if there might be in the process, and then be able to classify issues and so on, right? So there is a lot of work that needs to go into this, and AI needs to be made smart in itself to be able to really work in the field of justice. And even after that, we don't know if it's really going to be something that we can trust entirely. And so one of the solutions that people have been working on in this area, I see that someone's raised their hand, so I'm quickly going to complete this, and then we're anyway entering a Q&A, so we can discuss some questions there. So one of the solutions that in fact people at Stanford came up with is called Learned Hands. It's essentially a legal game where the idea is to present different cases, different stories. These are from people's everyday lives. They present their problems and simple sort of, legal cases or legal situations that they might find themselves in. And the idea is to basically increase access to justice through these AI models. And how do we do that? By making sure that people actually participate in it in a gamified manner, inform the system, and then the system further can inform itself, right? So it's all about sort of building on enough information or enough sort of intelligence. So the two different outcomes that were observed through this game were that one, AI systems were able to get the necessary information to train their algorithms, because as people engaged with the game, to basically engage in it and say, hey, this is how the legal situation could be solved, or this is right, or this is wrong, etc. The AI got smarter over time to understand what part of the law is easier to identify and what is not, and things like that. And the second is that even for students, lawyers, practitioners, this was a way to kind of engage with daily law and actually practice law in a gamified manner. So it kind of had two different outcomes that it was able to fulfill. Of course, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in the domain of AI for justice, but this is sort of a very simple start to at least start gathering that kind of intelligence and build on how users might react to a situation like this. So these were two different examples that we wanted to present to you. Of course, there are various different examples of how design thinking has been used, in different domains. One of the most famous ones is how the MRI machine itself was developed, especially for kids, and how it became something that kids were able to use. And it's a very famous case study. I'm sure if you look it up online, you'll find it. But with that, we have 10 minutes to go. So I want to make sure that people get a chance to ask questions. And so I'm going to stop here. And I think Sunil has a question. Would you want to unmute yourself, or I don't know if you would like to type it in?
Sunil, you can please ask your question. You have to unmute yourself. Till then, actually, I have a couple of questions, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
And
so
I think we also have a question from Sakshi. So I'll try and answer those also with yours, Urvashi.
okay, so if Sunil has his question ready, then maybe he can go. Otherwise, I can go with my questions.
No,
I
ma'am.
just
No,
have a
ma'am.
Okay, so my question is that after going through all of this, and the question which came to my mind is that is this true that legal design is still in a very nascent stage in India, or is it developed enough that Indian law students can think of it as a career opportunity?
Thank you for I can start, and Mahak, I don't know if you wanted to start, Mahak.
I think Siddharth, this is in your domain.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. So no, thanks, Urvashi. I think that's. I think it's still for us. I think we've been doing legal design in a very practical way at Justice Adda for the last almost 8 years. So it
And
is something. It is
and for
something
last
that
5 years, I know only you guys who've been doing this. So I wanted to understand.
Yeah, so I think I think there are instances of groups that are like exploring the intersection between law and design. I think for us specifically, we are interested also in how law and design contributes to access to justice. So I of course encourage anyone who's interested in exploring legal design as a research process, as a practical approach, to think about how they would like to use it. For us, I think it's not just you can use the methodologies that Mahak and I have shared, not just in a sort of legal design framework like the work that we do at Justice Adda, but also in litigation, also in teaching, also in the careers that you already are doing. So see this also as a methodology of thinking and practice. I think there is lots of potential for you to also apply it in the kinds of work that you do. But if you are also interested in exploring legal design more, you can write to us at Justice Adda and the Divan, and I think we'll be happy to also tell you a little bit more about how you can maybe get some internship experience if this is of interest. To your question, Sakshi, about whether there are courses on legal design. So last year we organized a hackathon, maybe it was now a couple of years ago, with Manupatra, which was more a deep dive into legal design, and we are also exploring doing a more sort of longer term course on legal design. So we will I think Urvashi already has all your contact details, so we will definitely get in touch once such a course is launched, and look forward to many of you participating. If you are interested in like resources on legal design, do check out our website, which is justiceadda.com, which has plenty of resources. Check out the Stanford Legal Design Lab, which has plenty of resources on legal design, and you will also find for instance, the University of Kent in the UK and the work of Amanda Caceres also is very instructive on legal design. So these are some really good resources that you can look at. Okay, so there are quite a few questions that are coming in. Meg, do you want to jump in on some of these questions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I can read out some of the questions, and then, wherever you think, because I think you're the subject matter expert, Siddharth. So I think another question is AI and natural justice, humanity in general, how will both go hand in hand? You want to start?
Yeah. Okay, I can. Yeah, I know. Thanks a lot. I think Mahak touched upon a really important aspect in the example, which is also some of the work that we're doing at Tilburg University. Is when one thinks about AI, in one sense, one is looking at it in terms of how it can make things more efficient or economical. But we also have to think about what are the kinds of structural barriers that actually exist, whether within the data or within developers. So we also have to look at what are the kinds of injustices that can actually emerge as a consequence of looking at using technology for particular services. So for instance, there's a case in the US that some of you may have already followed, where AI was used for sentencing to test recidivism and check whether people would risk again. And because of the type of data that was used, it was found that Black defendants were more at risk of being misclassified than white defendants. So we have in India, we've seen this also in research that has been done by CPAB, in terms of like policing and in terms of like the use of caste-based databases. So we also have to consider what are the kinds of challenges which are structural in nature that can be in the data and how these can be replicated through technology. So it is not as if technology is neutral. It is really deeply embedded in our socio-political context. So we need to also account for what are those challenges before we really think about the ways in which we can think about building such technology for legal services is my understanding.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, absolutely, there are structural issues that are going to be there. But I mean, to answer that question, it does seem like AI and like humans in general will go hand in hand from here on. I mean, there is no going back on this. I think just with like generative AI and how popular it's become, there's no really going back. So it's a question of how do we make sure that it's not biased going further. Next question, any website where I can get more information regarding the subject matter? I think, Siddharth, if you could just type in the name of the different resources that you mentioned in the chat, that might be helpful for everyone.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the questions are fairly
career-based
and similar in a sense. So I'm going to try and like answer them as best I can. I think to the question of whether legal design is at a nascent stage or not, I think as mentioned previously, I think that one needs to think about depends really what you mean by it being I think there are new roles that are emerging, whether at law schools, which look at sort of law firms, which look at legal innovation more generally, among startups that are looking at the intersection between law and technology and design, where you can very much employ legal design as an approach to your work. I think in terms of legal design firms specifically, this is also emerging in different domains, whether it is to do with contract review, whether it is to do with the work that we do at Justice Adda on access to justice. So there is certainly potential to be able to explore its use. But as I mentioned before, I think one of the things that Mahak and I are interested in doing is also how to use design thinking and design-based approaches for education more generally. So it's not as if you need to have a specific role which is called a legal designer, but you can also find ways of incorporating some of these design principles to your existing work. I think we're almost at time, but I'm going to I think some of the questions that you have raised on AI and looking at the implications of AI in legal design processes, I think this is a very interesting question. I think for me, I think one of the aspects of thinking about design is really about what are the ways in which we are able to center groups and users that we work with. If we are actually interested in building a user-centered approach, in what ways, even if we were to use AI, are you able to account for people and their experiences? So if this means, in the case that Mahak shared of AI for Justice from the Learned Hands example, why is that interesting? Is because they created a model that essentially was able to track and understand how people spot problems in legal processes. So they were able to understand what are the ways in which people would, for instance, assess a family dispute, a property dispute, a dispute that was in relation to inheritance, for instance. What do they see as some of those key aspects? So they also see a sort of interaction between the ways in which they could be able to understand people's experiences with the law and then draw patterns from it. So again, I think what is really critical and important is the ways in which you're able to make that connection between connecting to user experiences and understanding what that contextual approach is before developing a technology to any kind of problem that you see. I'm going to, Mahak, perhaps we can, I will type some of the websites that I just spoke about. And again, I think we will get in touch with Urvashi will also get in touch with you if we do something that is more extensive. So and yeah, we look forward to you also taking part in a longer workshop in the near future.
Yeah,
And I'm just going to write our email ID so that I think there were some questions about if people can work with us or explore something. So, feel free to write to us on these email IDs and then we can take it from there.
So I guess we're at a good point to wrap this up. And I would like to thank you both, Siddharth and Mahak, for such an informative session. To hold the attention of 100 people for an hour is not an easy feat. So thank you so much and congratulations to all of us on that. And people can also reach you, of course, on LinkedIn and know more about justice design at the Justice Adda website. And so I hope people have noted down the email IDs and they can reach you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Siddharth.
And thank you, Urvashi, for organizing.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.